Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Welcome listeners to Extrology, where once again we'll be exploring stories of triumph and transformation. I'm Lee Cooper, your host, and today I'm joined by Colin Day, a Chief Financial Officer from the financial services industry and the author of Man vs. Food. In his courageous book, Colin shares his profound journey through the challenges of anorexia, a condition seldom associated with men. This episode will not only shed light on the often hidden struggles around male vulnerability, but also inspire with tales of overcoming adversity. We'll debunk common myths around eating disorders and discuss how employers can truly uplift their team's well-being. Join us as we dive into a conversation filled with hope, connection, and the endless possibilities that await when we confront our deepest challenges. And a further note from my perspective, there was so much that Colin and I explored that we've made a bit of a break from the norm and a decision to split today's episode into two separate episodes. So be sure to tune in next week for the second half of Extrology with Colin Day. So what's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Colin Day, welcome to Extrology. Great to have you here. Good afternoon. Great to be speaking with you.
Likewise. Thank you very much. It's a long journey down here, 3 hours in the car. Went from sunny Sussex down to rainy Hampshire, but I'm really pleased to be here, so thank you.
Well, it's great to have you on, and I think we've got such a fascinating array of topics and a vitally important topic in particular to discuss today. But before we dive into that, I think for context for listeners, it's really useful to understand who you are, what you do, all that kind of good stuff. So for context for listeners, who's Colin Day?
Wow. I'm an ordinary guy. It's kind of the way I like to see myself. Actually, I am genuinely an ordinary guy, and I'm actually feeling a bit strange sat in the studio now because it's pretty uncomfortable, I guess. But no, who am I? I'm a dad, father of two, married to my wife Kerry. Professionally, I'm a CFO working for a large global insurer. I'm a football coach, under 13s team in East Grinstead. So I'll give a shout out to East Grinstead Meads Atletico under 13s because I doubt the boys will be listening to this, but I should do that. I'm a referee at grassroots level for my sins, and I'm an addict. I guess it's probably fair to say, and that's the reason why we're here today. Recovering addicts, but still, like many people facing the challenges that I've been through and still face, it's something that never goes away.
I think it's interesting that you utter that phrase, ordinary guy, and that's incredibly humble of you, and I respect that greatly. But I think it is interesting that you do many of the things that many a dad will do, coaching their kids' teams in whatever sport it might be, getting involved as a referee. You've got a professional career. How we define that term ordinary, I've always found fascinating because I think, without wishing to sound glib, I think we're all extraordinary actually. But I think it's important to note that it's no mean feat to reach the pinnacle of your profession. Arguably, as a professional accountant, to become the chief financial officer of any organisation is the pinnacle. We can argue that CFO becomes CEO. There is progression beyond. There is life beyond the CFO seat, undeniably. But that's no mean feat in itself. It's a great testimony to, I think, and we'll come on to the addiction to which you refer. But I think it's a great testimony to how, despite the battles that so many of us will face, and they're all contextual, they're all relevant to the individual. But despite the battles that so many of us will face, you can still overcome those battles, or almost despite those battles, still achieve what aspirations that you might have from whether it's a personal perspective, professional perspective, whatever it might be. It's not beyond the pale.
Yeah, I've always been, and it largely stems back to to childhood experiences, and particularly the relationship I had with my father, I have always been incredibly determined from a career perspective. And that was, largely trying to, as I say, stemming all the way back from my younger years, trying to prove a sense of self-worth effectively to my father. It took me years to work out that's where a lot of these behaviours had kind of stemmed from. But to get to where I have got professionally, actually it's only happened in the last 8 months, which coincides more or less with me coming out, around some of the challenges that I've faced personally with my mental health, and which has led me down a path to a certain type of addiction. And it's worth me calling out that actually my employer, I was very open. I went into the interview process for my current role, CFO, intentionally open about some of the challenges that I faced. It was my experiment to test whether or not a large corporate insurer would look at a candidate and actually say, we're not going to employ this guy because he comes with baggage. And they didn't. So I've got a lot of thanks, particularly for the CEO who's backed me and said that, hopefully this guy can come in and make a difference to the business, which I think I can.
What does that say to us about the role? I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but it strikes me as the right time to ask the question. What do you think that tells us about the role that vulnerability plays in evidencing true leadership?
It's a really good point. For me, authenticity is probably the biggest part of a strong leader in their armory. And authenticity comes often with vulnerability. We are all fallible. I say this word all the time. Unfortunately, particularly within my sector, within financial services, the ability to comfortably say that we have weaknesses is still way too, it just doesn't happen often enough. But the experience that I've been through personally, I've moved very much away from that, and I will talk very openly within the workplace and with my team, should they want to, hear about background, to actually go in as a leader and paint yourself in a light where you don't have all the answers. You're not an invincible individual. That, for me, I think encourages people to follow, because they know you're just a normal human being. You're not the person who's going to do absolutely everything, change the world and change it overnight. They want to work for someone who they can build a relationship with, who's, as I say, everyday and normal.
Do you think, though, that at what point did the courage to open yourself up to that authenticity, if you like? One of the things that strikes me as I'm reflecting on my own career, perhaps it's unique to me, but that as you're progressing through the various steps, if you like, whatever career choice you might make, but often I reflect back to, say, my early 20s, the perception was the person at the top is at the top because they know everything. They don't have any frailties. They're invincible. They're strong. And they project that image. Now, whether that was right or wrong, that was perhaps oftentimes my perception. And then how that fed down then through the layers of management was that to be showing vulnerability would have perhaps been evidence of perceived weakness rather than strength and courage. It might have been, that person's got some demons. We've all got our demons, but the rhetoric may have been, that person's got some demons that we don't want to unleash on the organisation. They're not equipped, or maybe still they're not tough enough, whatever that might mean.
Yep.
Even though we would both acknowledge, I'm sure, the toughness that it takes, the mental toughness that it takes to be able to open up as to some of the challenges that we face. But that was oftentimes a perception, wasn't it? So you would feel, I would feel, maybe it's a generational thing, but you would feel that to show any sort of perceived weakness here, that might mean I reach a ceiling and I might have to go somewhere else. Now, perhaps I'm a glass half full guy, and my hope is that we're reaching a world that maybe some of that stuff is starting to diminish and we're starting to see sense. But was that your experience too, that you had that kind of, I can't show any weakness as I'm progressing through my career. I've just got to power on through if I'm going to realise this drive that I have?
Yeah, well, I can tell you for a fact that particularly when I was, my darker days, suffering with challenges which will no doubt come on to. I was in London market, so London market insurance sector, and the type of challenge that I was facing was one that people don't associate with men, particularly professional men, encountering. I could never, and even when I was trying to seek help, I could never open up to my employer, never at the time, because I can pretty much say with more or less certainty I'd have been blackballed. And at that point, I was actually raising, going through the ranks, competing with my Oxbridge peers. I'm Northwest London, born and bred, working class background. Didn't go to university. I was fighting against some very, very well educated competitors. For me, that would have given them all the ammunition they needed to kind of blackball me, and I'd have been out. So I think we've moved on some way. I'm not convinced it's moved on to the same extent, particularly within London market insurance or financial services. But I don't think it's moved on as far as some of the large corporates would like us to believe it's moved on, particularly in terms of the what we see on the lights. For those of us on LinkedIn, I will use the term virtue signalling a lot, and there is a lot of stuff on there around how particularly businesses in my sector are doing a great deal to support and raise awareness around mental health matters, and particularly mental health in men. For me, in fact, I used to be glass half empty. I'm getting towards the glass half full, but I'm very, very skeptical around whether or not some of the stuff that we do actually see on social media, the corporate social media side of things, is actually happening in the workplace. What I would call marketing collateral.
How did that let's term it inability, if you like, or lack of opportunity, that's a better phrase, I think, to open up, the perhaps fear that were you to do so, that the impact that would have on your aspirations would have been significantly curtailed those aspirations perhaps, or they would have been denied to you for what, again, we might have been perceived as weakness. How did that make you feel? How did that manifest for you?
Well, I mean, firstly, it's probably worth saying that it's not just about the aspirations, and it's we do need to recognise that. Particularly in the professional environment, and things are changing. But whilst we live in a world where people like things to change overnight, they take time to change, and there are still a vast majority, particularly in the city, where the guys that are working, particularly men, and we know that men don't like to open up, they are often the family breadwinner. So it's not just about the implications on aspirations, it's the implications for the family home, So for me and for many other guys that I guess are in the same situation or a similar situation, they're gambling with their families as well by coming out and by being very open about their personal vulnerabilities. It's a really hard situation to actually, for people to actually cope with, and I found when I got to the stage where I was in the deepest, darkest depths of hell, to be fair, there was no way I could have come out, because I've got 2 children, I've got a mortgage, I've got everything else that comes with it, and I don't think my employer would have pushed me out the door at all, far from. But if you're in a market, particularly a London insurance market, which is incestuous, it's an incestuous market. Everyone knows everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you come out outwardly and say, in fact, no, if you don't mind, I'm going to say it now. I'm a male anorectic. I have anorexia nervosa.
Yeah, I was going to ask you my next question. You've got to talk about that. But yeah, let's get that out there.
So London market, suited and booted, pinstripes. Everyone can visualise it. Working their way up the ranks in the finance sector within the insurance sector, and you've got anorexia. How does that go down? Well, if there's any reason for someone to be blackballed in that type of culture, well, that's where it's going to happen. So I just couldn't. I couldn't.
Do you think
it's taken me years.
I don't quite know how to phrase this in the right way, but do you think it would have been easier? I'm not saying it's ever easy if you suffer from these two things, but given the nature of what we know of the markets and how they're perceived as quite a macho, historically, maybe that's changing, but historically a very macho culture. If you'd have said you were an alcoholic or a drug addict, there might have been more understanding, possibly,
100%.
around those addictions, given that we read lots, we hear lots, lots is reported as to, some of the chat. I've had people on this podcast who suffered from those addictions, from being in those not necessarily as a direct result of those environments, but certainly there was a lot of pressure in those environments, for going for a beer with the boys on Thursday night after work, and who knows where that leads. So do you think it would have been easier if that was the challenge that you were facing?
Yeah, I would say 100%. And that is by no means diminishing.
No, I'm not saying
the seriousness of those conditions.
100%. I totally agree.
They are just as, all addiction from is evil.
Yeah.
It's self-punishment.
Perhaps easier for people to understand.
But
maybe.
Definitely easier to understand, 100%. So there was, when I worked at RSA, there was one of the CFOs there openly had a problem with alcohol and was an alcoholic, a recovering alcoholic, but would be very open about that challenging relationship that he had with alcohol. So I would say absolutely there are certain forms of addiction that I would say are more accepting by society. They are equally as debilitating as what I would term niche forms of addiction, of which I would say, mine would probably fall within, particularly because I'm a guy. So it does make it more environments in the workplace, I think, are pretty good in terms of, as I say, alcohol, drug addiction. But yeah, when it comes to, as I say, eating disorders, that type of stuff, and there are some pretty, I would say, debilitating other forms of addiction that are now forming more, particularly with the online presence that people just don't think of. Pornography, growing problems in that place. I mean, can you imagine going to work and saying I've got an addiction to porn?
Yeah.
And you can turn that into kind of a joke or a laughable subject matter. But actually, it's serious.
Yeah,
it's really, really serious, and it's a growing problem.
So, what was your journey? What was your journey into addiction?
So, my journey into addiction, I thought when I was first diagnosed with anorexia, which was right at the end of 2014, I thought it kind of hit me like a bus. In terms of it happened overnight, if that makes sense. It probably took me about 3 or 4, maybe 5 years actually, and a lot of recent thinking to realise actually I'd been on that path since I was probably about 8 years old. And it does, one of the things that this type of life event has, you can choose to ignore it, or you can get right inside you and start to understand the journey that you've been on that's got you to that cliff edge moment. And it did. It started more or less when my dad left home when I was 8, and left myself and my mum. I'm a single child. My mum, and she won't mind me saying this publicly, has suffered herself, at the hands of mental fragility, I think it's fair to say. And from there on, it was us. My dad was still around, but I then spent early childhood into teenage years, even into my 20s and early 30s, pushing myself, like really, really pushing myself so hard, just to try and get that sense of, as I say, sense of self-worth through my dad actually being kind of proud of me. Now, ironically, my dad was an alcoholic, or became an alcoholic. He's no longer around, as my grandfather was, my paternal grandfather. But when I really started to go off the rails, because I had what I would call events of self-sabotage all the way through my teens into my 20s, was when my father was diagnosed with cancer. So he was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus, and we went through. It probably took about 9 months for my father to eventually pass away. And for someone who hadn't, don't get me wrong, my dad was there. My dad was there as a kid, but had never connected with me or been there as what I would call, a loving dad. Someone who was always there for his kids regardless. The type of dad that I want to be, and the type of dad that most dads want to be. But when he became really ill, I took it upon myself to kind of be there for him, and that resulted in eventually he ended up in hospice. I've got 2 half sisters, and they were doing an absolutely fantastic job. They're younger than me, kind of 13 years younger than me. But I ended up in a hospice with him for the last weeks of his life, whilst working. And I always remember it. I was sitting in the room with him. And I don't want to trigger anyone, because this is, but this is the reality of, what sometimes happens in life. And I was sat in his room in the hospice, effectively watching him die,
yep,
whilst writing board papers for my employer. And this comes back to the point around, when do you show vulnerability? Because there's a deadline I got to hit. And he did eventually die, and I was there when it happened. And all I can say is, it was the worst experience that I'd ever been through, particularly watching someone pass away from cancer, and the pain and suffering that he had to go through. And I'm an animal lover, and I feel very, very strongly about how well we treat animals in that situation versus people, and it's for me it's a real shame. But after that had happened, that was when I really started to go off the rails. I was 5 years previous, I started to really get into running. Joined my local running club in East Grinstead. I even set up the first annual race in the town, so a 10K race, which went on to make loads of money for charity. Run a handful of marathons, cross-country running. I got really into it. I absolutely loved it. It was my social life. Me, 3 other guys in spandex on a Sunday morning, going out at 8 o'clock when everyone's got a hangover and running 19 miles or whatever it was. That was my life. But what I found was, when my dad died, a switch flicked, and I found myself using running as my means to try and control my emotions. And it became an absolute obsession. By the December of the year my father passed away, I was running 110 miles a week whilst doing a 60-hour-a-week job in the city. And I started to restrict my calorie intake, my food.
If I may just jump in a second, how on earth were you fitting in 110 miles a week with a 60-hour job? What to give us a sense of how that was impacting your life? Because as you pointed out from the get-go, you're also a married man with a family, which you clearly love, dearly. That's very, very clear. But how are you managing all that? Because that in itself is creating enormous pressures, right?
Massively, yeah.
You're an achiever. You're someone who wants to achieve. I would imagine, therefore, you're not going to do anything half-baked. So you're going to be the best dad you can possibly be, the best husband you can possibly be, the best son you can possibly be, the best runner you can possibly be. You're driven to you're wired that way, Colin, is my sense. How are you fitting all that in?
I'd say I am wired that way. I would be, and I'm a brutally honest person. I definitely wasn't the best husband, and I definitely wasn't the best father at that moment in time. I'd become insular. Everything was inside me. If I'm being brutally honest, I would say at that point, I wasn't a very nice person to live with. There was so much anger and pent up frustration with the fact, and the reason why that frustration was there was that I'd given something very personal to my father by being there when he passed that I'd never had from him. And I felt that I'd given a piece of me away, and I was angry. And things never got, that bad at home where, I can imagine where people's minds are going, things got physical or anything. Nothing like that. But I was emotionally absent.
And the running became a release? That's a simple journey, simple correlation to draw, but is that what it was giving you? It was giving you that out. It was giving you not only the endorphins and all the positive things that we would recognise that exercise would afford us, but also mentally it's giving you that chance to detach yourself and just be with your thoughts and take yourself off to another place.
Yeah, it became initially yes, but then it became really obsessive. And your point, I probably haven't answered your question fully around, the practicality of how you were doing it, or how I was doing it. Well, how was I running well over 100 miles a week? I was getting up at 4:30 in the morning, run downstairs, get my kit on, out, do a half marathon, back by 6:30, on the train into London at 7:20 in the morning, back home at 9:00 at night, something quick to eat, into bed, back up at 4:30 again in the morning, right? And you imagine when you're doing that over a period of time, the strain that starts to put on your body. Sometimes I was getting on the first train out of East Grinstead at kind of 5 a.m., big backpack on, getting a train into somewhere like Balham or Clapham, and then doing a 12-mile run, taking detours to get into the office with a big backpack on. There are always ways. It's like any form of addiction, you'll find a way. Once you start to get hooked on it, you will always find a way.
And what informed the decision initially around the calorie restriction? What was it that started to persuade you down that path?
I've never actually, and I've thought about this a lot. I've thought about this a lot in terms of the moment when that first started to happen, because historically, I loved my food. Never had a problem. Yeah, I was.
You never had a sense prior when you were growing up, any sort of issues around.
I mean, I was definitely overweight when I was at school. Definitely overweight. The way I describe myself without making the situation too light-hearted, I was like Roland out of Grange Hill. For those who are old enough to remember, for those who aren't, Google it. So I think I was always quite conscientious, but it was when something happened where it triggered a feeling of control. I felt in control. Yeah.
Because I'm sat here wondering, you're burning, you're a smart man. You're burning a lot of calories. And I'd have gone, so I need the calories for the energy to run better.
Yep.
Or do I go, this is my simplistic mindset. Actually, if I get lighter, I can move quicker. I'm not lumping around so much weight, therefore I can shift a bit quicker. I become a faster runner.
Yep.
There's probably a balance somewhere in the middle, isn't there? That says if you get that calorie intake just right, you're consuming just enough that you can get the miles in, but you're also starting to reduce your body fat and your weight, and therefore your ability to move the body quicker as well. Yeah,
I think there probably was a bit of that. I had tried kind of various diets when I was marathon running. Actually, interestingly enough, or maybe not for those who aren't runners, my marathon PB, which was just over 3 hours, I had done that when I had trialled this diet, which was called the salt-in diet. I think it was relatively new at the time. It's not now, but effectively it's, depleting carbs, lots of protein, etc. It's the stuff you kind of hear about all the time. But you had to do that, and you had to train intensively with it. So you actually, you lose a lot of the glycogen in your muscles, and then you pump them up right at the end. I think I'd maybe there was a connection when I started to go down that kind of thinking diet and exercise, combining the nutrition with performance. But I think where I'd ended in a really bad place, for me, there was just this, it was a feeling of being in control and also my way of self-harming.
Did you recognise it as self-harm at that point, though? No.
Never. No, I didn't. But it was my form of, the combination of the running, where I was burning probably 2,000 calories a day purely in running. That doesn't take into account all the walking as well.
Yeah. And all the brain power you're consuming through the course of your job. I heard something the other day that suggests that a chess grandmaster, in the course of one grandmaster competition, whatever that might mean, but will consume 10,000 calories. Sat on their backside playing chess.
Your brain burns more calories than any other part of your body. So you're
factoring that in as well, right? So there's the physicality, there's the mental expenditure. It's a huge consumption. And so your body then starts, in effect, basically your body starts eating itself, doesn't it? In order to survive, your body goes into survival mode, which means, right, I'm going to start drawing on your fat stores and whatever resources I can find in this thing, because your brain said, I need to keep you alive, Colin. That's my job here. My function is to keep you going. I'm going to find whatever I can that's available to me to be able to do that.
Fat stores, then into muscle.
Yeah.
And when the muscle depletion goes, that's when it becomes really, really evident.
Can I ask a question? Partly my intrigue, but do you start to see that? Can you see that? Or does it take... And I'd imagine possibly when someone points it out to you, you still don't want to see it anyway, but can you see it yourself?
No, I thought I was at that stage when the obsession really started. That was when I thought I was obese. I was overweight. It sounds absolutely ridiculous.
I get it, because that's consistent with what I'm led to believe. But
But no, I couldn't. I could not see. So when you've got your full rib cage, literally, showing when you're looking yourself in the mirror, I could not see that. I could not see that. And
do you think psychologically as well, that's partly because in your mind, so I guess if we draw, we grew up in the 80s, the thing that springs to my mind when you start to describe this type of images you're describing, I think of the Ethiopian famine. That might be an awful analogy to draw, and I apologise for anyone that I offend, but my mind has directly gone to that kind of, that K80 in Ethiopia.
Absolutely.
Report, or Michael Burke, wasn't it? Michael Burke, K80.
I understand.
So when you think famine and hunger, real hunger, so, that's, but I suppose in your mind, you're fit, right? So you're going, I'm a fit guy. I can run half marathon. I run a half marathon before most people have had their breakfast. So I guess that's also then psychologically, you've got that struggle around, part of your brain's going, good job, Colin, you're fit as a flea. Part of your brain's going, you're overweight, Colin, you need to lose some weight. You've got this constant conflict and struggle that you're wrestling with in your mind. Massively. As to how do I, this is clearly, I'm no psychologist. It's very evident in my line of questioning, but that's the struggle that you're constantly wrestling with. Is that fair? To assume? Yeah,
100%. Look, when any form of addiction is a constant struggle. An eating disorder, or particularly the type of eating disorder that I had, which carries incidentally the highest death rate in any form of mental illness, you are constantly in that struggle. And it's interesting, actually, you that mental image of what we saw in the 80s in terms of Ethiopia, and it was I remember seeing it as a kid, and it was absolutely awful,
harrowing, wasn't it? Utterly harrowing.
But in my darkest moments, honestly, I would have quite happily given my life for one of those poor starving kids, because I was doing it to myself. This is the difference, that innocent child who's malnourished, and I can see the frame where they're kind of ballooned because of where they are so hungry. I would have honestly swapped just to give someone else a chance, because we're in I'm in the UK, I'm in sixth richest country in the world. I'm in a good job. I've got money. I can afford to feed myself, but I'm deciding not to. I'm not only deciding not to feed myself, I'm also decided to punish myself through exercise. So it's a double whammy.
And some people who don't understand addiction would level that kind of back at you and go, so you're doing it by choice. So I think there's so much misunderstanding around addiction, isn't there? But you're doing it by choice. So just give yourself a decent meal. I think that's a really, pardon my turn of phrase, but the reality is I've heard, whenever you've heard about people talking about addiction, we live, keyboard warriors are all the rage, aren't they? But all people, just give yourself a decent meal. Stop, don't have that drink, or or don't put that bet on. Whatever you want to draw, you've got a choice. You can walk away from it. The reality is you can't. To your point around addiction is that you're compelled to behave that way.
Yep.
So at what point do you realise that? At what point does it become insurmountable and you need help?
So I realised that, I would say probably about 4 months after my father had died. My wife did her best to flag to me. I think it's probably the right.
She must have been worried sick, right?
Look, I've got. I look back on. I don't know whether she'll listen to this. Actually, I look back on those times with immense regret. I also look back on those times and know that I wasn't well. It wasn't me. I turned into someone who was, I guess, not a terribly nice person to be around, which made it very difficult for her to raise her kind of, a genuine concerns about my health.
But I think you make a really important point that often I think gets not overlooked, but maybe misunderstood, is that to your point, you're not well. You're unwell.
Oh yeah, I'm ill.
If
it's not
you're
me.
Ill, exactly, it's not you. You're ill. So I think that, and where people, I think, and I'm being very assumptive, maybe not to be, but I think sometimes people think, but you have a choice. When you don't, that's part of the addiction. And I think, heaven forbid, but had you been diagnosed with something where people could go, poor Colin, he's got that. Mm-hmm. People would have. There's more understanding, isn't there?
There is far more empathy.
We sort of have this. We attribute levels of importance or whatever it might be to certain types of suffering. So heaven forbid, awful. You've explained your father's experiences, but cancer, there's that immediate acknowledgement of like,
yes,
that's awful. So we apply degrees of awfulness to things naturally because we understand the severity of them. But when it comes to addiction, we don't always necessarily apply that same level of understanding, which seems wrong. So to your point, you're ill.
Yep.
It's not you. It needs medical intervention to fix you.
Correct.
Where any other number of things, heaven forbid, again, like I say, I wouldn't wish it upon you, but any other types of disease, people would have gone, oh no, Colin, you need a pill for that, or there's a treatment for that, or there's we put you in a hospital bed and we give you something and it fixes you and you'll come out in whatever time. We get that, but we don't always necessarily apply the same degree of maybe sympathy, empathy when it comes to addiction. Oh, and I wonder why that is.
I think I don't know. It's really difficult. I mean, there were times when this sounds really, it's a horrible thing to say, or it feels like a horrible thing to say. It's not intended, but I actually would have swapped my situation to have had a cancer diagnosis myself. I'm saying this thinking that is a really bad thing to say.
But do you think that's because perhaps it's more you can understand, you can go, right, so I get why, so something's happened to something in my body's happened, picked something up that's gone, right, that's now a thing. it's manifest in the form of
and
an
there
illness.
is a treatment that can, so there is something there, or there are forms of treatment that can or give someone a chance. At that stage, in my deepest, darkest moments, I had no way of knowing how the hell I was going to get out of this, because part of the reason I think why there's this, I'm not sure it's a lack of empathy around addiction. I think it's just a lack of understanding.
Lack of understanding, I think, or perhaps
because it's so complex. And I also think that the large parts of the medical profession still don't understand it.
Yeah, okay.
Whereas physical conditions, whilst we know that there is, there's a huge amount of still unknowns, but there appears to be a steady stream of breakthroughs in various different conditions. The understanding of the mind, I think, is still relatively unknown. So I think people are scared of it.
Well, I think to your point,
and I can understand that.
Yeah, similarly, I've always maintained, it's a daft analogy again to draw, but if you break your leg, you have a cast on your leg, and people go, "Oh, poor you, what you done?" But if you start to explain, we'll come on to talk about mental health in due course. But when you come to explain to someone that you've got challenges around mental health, you watch people's eyes glaze over if they've never, because they can't relate to it. They can't look at it and go, "Yeah, so my mind computes." What does that mean? You got mental health, but what does that mean? You're feeling a bit down? Come on, pull yourself together. Or whatever the expressions that might impart. Yeah. We're getting to a place where it's much, much more understood than ever it was. Yes. I still get a sense we've got light years to go to gain the real depth of understanding that can truly start to help people who are really suffering. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject around this whole story around addiction, the whole where it stems from, how it manifests. I would imagine, to your point, being anorexic, was there a moment where, to your point, there was a diagnosis that somebody goes, that's it, this is what we're going to call it? How did you feel when someone sat you down and said, right, this is what you have? How was that feeling for you?
So that was my GP. I eventually threw in the towel and went to see my doctor.
Of your own volition or encouragement from nearest and dearest?
My wife encouraged me, and to be fair, my mum. But yeah, my wife. I went to see my doctor. Very, very clear and brilliant GP. He gave me half an hour of her time, which is more or less unheard of these days. And she basically said, "Look, I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty sure this is the problem," and referred me into the West Sussex Eating Disorder Service. How did I feel? I actually felt a sense of relief to a certain extent, because I was able to connect something with all the crap that was going on in my life. And crap is a word that's completely underestimating or understating the scale of harm that was being done, not just about myself but my family. So yeah, I think relief is probably the word I would use.
And do you mind me asking, again, so people can understand? I mean, I've got the benefit of sitting across from you, and you look in great shape. You're a tall, fit, lean guy. But what sort of what sort of weight were you? What were your statistics, if you like? I can't think of a better phrase, but what were we talking about here? Because what would you be, 6? You must be 6'2".
I'm probably 6'2" now. Probably lost an inch because I'm getting on a bit now. I was. We might come on to this, but if we're talking statistics, I'll go to BMI, which is, for me, it's a very blunt tool.
Yeah.
It's still used by public health services and private sector when deciding or deciphering whether or not someone needs care who's got anorexia. But my BMI dropped. So standard BMI, I think for a guy of my height was, should be around about 23, 24. That's a healthy, well in the green range. I dropped to 15.3. I was 60. I think it was 64 kg. So that's 9 stone something in old pounds and pence. And I was 6'2". There was nothing of me.
And how did you feel physically at that point? Did you feel lifeless and no energy? Yeah. Right.
Literally,
so you did have that sense of,
energy.
My body is literally eating itself. Consuming myself.
Yeah, my body was it was literally consuming itself.
Yeah, so you're lifeless. Yeah, no energy.
All the muscle I'd built with kind of the running.
Yeah,
that had pretty much all gone. My waist had gone down to I think I was kind of a 26, 27 inch waist. It was literally, there was nothing of me. I was bone. I was still running. Yeah, my heart rate at my lowest standing pulse got down to 41.
Goodness. So what's the journey up? Part of there's a from all adversity, but nonetheless great adversity in your case. There is a real positive story behind this, which I want to come on to and talk about. But recovery I'd imagine it's an ongoing commitment. It's a constant battle. But
it is.
What is that recovery? Because, like I say, I sit across from you now, a little picture of health, and all credit you. But I know that wouldn't have been achieved without some considerable tougher times and darker days and blood, sweat and tears to have gotten you there. So what's the journey? You sit down with your doctor, right, here's the problem.
Yep.
Where do we go from here?
So I mean, the journey to recovery has been long and I think arduous. And part of that, I think, comes back to my point around, I think a lot of professionals still don't understand the condition that I was in and addiction as a whole. I mean, I'll give you a sense. The journey started with public health services, coming around and seeing my wife and I, to talk around how we need to, or things that I need to change to start getting better. And the obvious answer to the medical profession, which is often the case, with a lot of people, was stick me on a load of antidepressants. Which isn't. I wasn't actually. Well, I was depressed, but that wasn't the cause of the problem. And prescribed me with a plan which basically says you stop all exercise and you eat 3,500-4,000 calories a day.
So my first, as you were going to say that, the thought that's going through my head, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to share this with you now, is I'm literally going to, if you could read my mind, my thought pattern was, well, surely the worst thing to do, a lot of people would just go, well, just eat a load of stuff and stop running, right? It's not as simple as that. There's a journey. But the medical professionals have basically said, stop running and eat a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. It's like saying
it's that easy, right?
Saying to an alcoholic, just don't drink.
Just don't drink.
Just don't drink.
Go and sit in the pub, but have a soft drink.
Yeah. but actually, and particularly with anorexia, it's really unique as a form of addiction, because I would say, and this is just my own conclusion on my words, it's the only form of addiction I can think of where you need to do more to get better. You need to eat more.
This is fascinating.
Yeah. Restriction, which is effectively how most forms of addiction are dealt with, you do less. This is the polar opposite.
Or none at all, don't you? I mean, if you think for a recovering alcoholic, no booze. For a recovering gambling addict, no bets.
Abstinence is the key.
For a drug addict, no more gear. Whatever you want to define it is, it's just restriction is the answer.
Yep.
Whereas anorexia is all about restriction. It's restriction that's caused the addiction, or is a symptom of the addiction, however that's determined from the outset. So you've got to go completely the other way to all other addictions.
Absolutely.
You've got to start putting the stuff in that for the longest time you've been imagining is doing you harm.
And at the same time restrict on the exercise. And this
Which
is
you
where,
believe is doing you good.
Yeah. And when you've got a depleted brain, because at one stage, you talk about your body eating itself. One of the first areas where that will happen once your fat sources have been depleted is your brain. And I was told by a medical profession, there was no scans or anything at one point, but they said your brain has shrunk to the size of a 8 or 9-year-old. And this is why, honestly, it depletes your brain capacity. It just shrinks.
Had you seen signs of performance at work diminish as a consequence of that depletion?
Yes, I would say so.
That you would notice, or would you tend to deny that? Again, that kind of classic. I don't want to go through, diagnose you, but that sort of classic addict behaviour is deny. That's not what I'm seeing.
I would say that the main way in which my performance depleted wasn't necessary in terms of my output. I would say if anything, the thing that suffered most was my leadership capability.
Right.
So my ability to empathise with people I work, who either work for me or people I work with, was pretty much zero. I would say that my leadership style probably moved to more of a autocratic style. I didn't have patience. You can imagine if you've got no fuel in your system, you become irritable, you become impatient, and I would say as a consequence of that, my performance dropped. Output was okay, but as a leader, I think for me that's what I should be judged on.
Mm-hmm. So that journey to recovery, is it literally, as I might have imagined, as we're led to believe, you have the 12-step type programs that you get for a lot of recovering addicts in whatever form that addiction manifests. Is it similar do you have that tag? Apologies for my very clumsy questioning, but that sort of, if you're anorectic, you're always anorectic in much the same way that you're an alcoholic. You're always a recovering alcoholic. Is it the same?
I am.
It's applicable the same way?
Absolutely. It took me 6 years probably to accept that. Because when I was first diagnosed with anorexia, I, like most other people, thought that a pill would help me. I would get some drugs from the doctors that would make me feel happy and everything would go back to normal. That's not the reality.
And how much of that reaction, and I want to come on to this, because if I look at even my first thought, we've talked about this, again, we're of a similar vintage. So growing up in the 80s as a kid in the UK, the good news was that eating disorders were a thing that were discussed. There was an awareness around it. I'm not suggesting it was an integral part of our school lives, but there was undeniably awareness around it. There were an awareness around drug addiction. I remember a number of campaigns. You mentioned Grange Hill. I remember, there were lots of things that we were able to understand, or at least to be discussed and were talked about. And certainly eating disorders were on the agenda, and there's a big but coming, but they were on the female agenda. That's how I remember it. And that might be distinctly unfair to all of my teachers, but as I remember my school life, girls were talked to about eating disorders as something to understand. Boys weren't part of the conversation. So when I first read of your challenges and your addiction and the great efforts you've made to overcome, and we're going to come on to that, my first thought was, I didn't know men got anorexia. I just had I was appalled that was my mindset. That's the first place my mind went to. No. That's not what guys get. But I since subsequently understand, I think, am I right in saying it's 1 in 3 eating disorders are attributed to men? Is that right?
Yeah. So look, I was in exactly the same space as you.
Yeah.
Until I got it, I didn't.
I'm appalled at my ignorance.
Yeah, but I was in the same space. I was in exactly the same space.
Did you have that when you were told that's what was there a moment where you kind of go, what?
Yes, there was. I would say the overwhelming feeling was one of relief, just because I had a sense of what the hell was wrong with me, to be frank. But there are various different studies, but most are pointing towards at least 20% of all cases are now in men. I think the other thing that people always attribute, anorexia or eating disorders as being a result of are kind of, body dysmorphia or all the stuff we see. And particularly now, it's more prevalent now in terms of, perfect body images online. It used to be glossy magazines, etc. I think that very much does still play a part, probably in the younger generations. But actually, I would say that just from my own experience, they're often not the root cause. It is often a a traumatic experience or a triggering event that has led to a connection with, it's not always over-exercise, but a connection with starvation as a means to feel like you're in control of what feels like an uncontrollable situation.
I think I remember the thought process that went through my mind when I read your LinkedIn post as it was, highlighting your addiction. And then my instant premise around, instant reaction around, well, that's a female challenge. How's that happened? I then went back to your point. I've 2 children of my own, been through their teens, come out the other side. But I remember discussions from school around body image for boys and, the pressure around, the social media, that again, my misunderstanding, my ignorance, but I'd sort of, had those concerns around having a teenage daughter and what impact would social media have on her, pressures on her to comply and body image and all that sort of stuff. And then thinking, I didn't even give it a thought for haven't given it a thought for my son. And then thinking, I have to give it some thought. It is something that boys have to contend with. And yeah, so I think this society, these sort of societal constructs and restraints, maybe that's just me, but my sense is there's a broader image or a broader challenge around talking about some of these issues that affect men. And we're going to come on to talk about men opening up and that vulnerability that you've already alluded to. But I mean,
there's one thing I would say, if you don't mind me interrupting, just around the social media side of things. So I do, for me, I've got grave concerns around the role that social media plays within today's world. But when it comes to forms of addiction like anorexia, actually, the images that we see on social media, yes, I guess they can trigger, particularly in younger children, negative feelings around, their own body and how that stacks up against others. Where social media probably causes the biggest level of harm in forms of addiction like anorexia is actually it feeds the illness. You've got a world of people that you can connect with that will feed you with ideas to fuel the illness, if that makes sense.
So there's that confirmation bias that comes from that space.
But not only does that harm or potentially work to harm the person who's actually affected, the searcher. Actually, we do know with social media, there is, I've got younger kids. The more people you're connected with, the greater the sense of euphoria or power. You've got young kids that are affected by this illness, that are using the illness to actually generate a growing social media profile. And I've done some research on this, and it really is. It's so disturbing. It's so disturbing that these platforms actually allow this to happen. And yes, you might get a case of you need to be over 18 to enter this part of Instagram or wherever it may be. But it's really worrying. It's really, really worrying.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to today's Extrology podcast. I really appreciate your audience and ears. If you've enjoyed it, then why not hop onto iTunes and give us a review? I'd really appreciate anything that you might have to say. Any feedback always gratefully received, and look forward to hosting you next time. See you soon. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.